this is the first lesson in Unit 2 of Richard and John. Now, what this lesson will look at is the history of the Crusades and the causes of the Third Crusade. So firstly, we need to understand what the term crusade actually means, look at the history of the Crusade, and then evaluate the immediate causes of the Third Crusade. So we've now got a different specification, which is moved on from Unit 1. This is, if you look at the top bullet point, we're going to look at the concept of a crusade, so what it actually is, and the immediate causes of the Third Crusade. So, this lesson is quite simplistic, but first we must understand what a crusade actually is. So, a crusade was a holy war fought by Christians. Basically, it's a religious war. Now, at the time, in medieval England, the main objective of a crusade was to restore the Holy Land, especially Jerusalem, to Christian control. So the point of it was to keep or get Jerusalem under the control of Christians. But by 1095, these lands had fallen into the hands of the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks were a group of Muslims, and the Christians were hostile to them because of their faith and because of the fact that they had the Holy Land. Now, the reason why Jerusalem is so symbolic to Christians is because of the fact of the connotations and the links to Jesus. Now, in 1095, Pope Urban II called upon Christians to rescue Jerusalem and the Holy Land. So the Pope, who's based in Rome, came out and said, we need to get Jerusalem back. And he called for a war against the Seljuk Turks. And this was known as the First Crusade. Now, the problem with the Crusade is that Crusades is a war, and war condones violence. Violence goes against Christianity. So because the church was against violence, it says here, it was a problem as the church was against violence, but it was not a pacifist, and it developed teachings which said that Christians could fight. So what happened was the Pope, or there was this concept known as just war. The church said that you could fight, that war was allowed if it was called by a legitimate authority. So that means someone in a position of high power, in this case, the Pope. War had to have a reason, a cause for it, and that was to get Jerusalem back. Under the eyes of the church, that was a good reason to fight. And war should be fought with minimum violence. And that one's going to be difficult, but it was still that concept, that planning of it. These rules, there were a few more to this, but these were known as just war. However, there were also problems because violence could condemn a man to hell. And to prevent this, any man who took part in a crusade could be given an indulgence. Now, an indulgence means that they will go straight to heaven rather than having to do penance, so sort of like punishment for their sins. The promise of an indulgence would be given by the Pope or a papal legate. Now, a papal legate is someone who represents the Pope, who has the same authority, but they do it in the name of the Pope rather than being the Pope. Crusades were a way of protecting the holiest place in the world, a place Christians saw as the centre of the world and is symbolic to the life of Jesus. So the first thing to do here is you've got 6 questions there. Subtitle being, what is a crusade? Fill in the gap. So a crusade was a war fought by Christians against the what? The Pope who called the First Crusade was who? Just war means one idea of just war, that it needed to be fought with minimum what? An indulgence appealed to knights because, and Jerusalem was vitally important to Christians because. Spend 5 minutes answering those questions and pause the video, ready to move on to the next task. So, the next task, I'm going to give you a history of the 2 crusades that happened before the one that we have to look at for the exam. It's quite important to understand these crusades to be able to give a backdrop to it. So the first crusade was in 1095 to 1099, the one we just briefly spoke about, but the one you need to know about the most for the exam is the third one. So the First Crusade was called by Pope Urban II in 1095. Pope Urban called all Christians in Western Europe to travel east and fight against a group of Muslims called the Seljuk Turks. He claimed they were stopping Christians from visiting the holy city of Jerusalem, where Christ had been crucified. Well, if we remember one thing, why would people travel to Jerusalem? To go on a pilgrimage. If you don't remember what a pilgrimage is a long holy walk to try and remove people's sins or to spend less time in purgatory. Pope Urban promised anyone who took part in the crusade they would have reward with an indulgence to heaven, basically a pass to heaven. It was successful and 100,000 Christians took part in the crusade. Jerusalem was recaptured in 1099 with Christians rampaging, taking gold, silver, horses and many other possessions. Jews were burned in their synagogues while Muslims were tortured, with around 10,000 being killed. All Christians who took part in this were given a full indulgence, meaning they spent no time in purgatory. And the Christians were successful in the First Crusade. Now, what needs to be understood is that after the First Crusade, Christians were able to hold on to land by conquering land around Jerusalem, including Tripoli, Acca, and Jaffa. These were important coastal towns, and it's really important to hold on to these because if you have a coastal town, you can get to the area quicker. If you don't have access to these towns, you may have to land somewhere and walk. On top of this, though, it must be understood that in the years 1095 to 1099, the Muslims were fighting each other as well. So it was difficult for them to keep hold of the Holy Land when they were fighting each other. You've got some questions here. As I go through the history of each one, answer the questions. So pause the video now. When was the First Crusade? Why did the First Crusade happen? What promise did people who took part get? Who won the First Crusade? And what land did Christians get after the First Crusade? So just pause the video, write the questions down and answer the questions. Okay, the next part of task 2 is looking at the Second Crusade. There's a big gap between the First and Second Crusade. Crusades don't happen one after the other. There's usually big gaps. And the reason why the Second Crusade happened in the years 1147 to 1149 was because in 1144, Muslims who were led by a man called Zengi recaptured one of the Crusader lands. So an area that was important to the Crusaders called Edessa, massacring Christians. Now, if Edessa was captured, it means that Jerusalem would be at threat. So it led to Christians who lived in the Crusader states to ask for help, which led to a crusade. The reason why they asked for help was because of the fear that the Muslims would attack Jerusalem and capture Jerusalem. The one thing they didn't do in the Second Crusade was do that. They never captured Jerusalem. They captured Edessa. They didn't capture Jerusalem. Eleanor of Aquitaine took part. Now, we should know Eleanor of Aquitaine's name. She married Henry II, but at this time, she was actually on crusade with her husband before Henry II, Louis VII of France. And the Second Crusade actually was a failure for the Christians because they were regularly attacked as they crossed Anatolia by Seljuk Turks. And by the end of the 12th century, Zengi had died and he was replaced by Saladin. And what Saladin did was he brought the Muslims together. They weren't fighting anymore, which made it easier for them to keep hold of land in the Holy Land and conquer back large areas in the Crusader kingdom. The one place they didn't get yet was Jerusalem. So that's key for the Second Crusade. The key thing about the Second Crusade is the Muslims were stronger. The Muslims were unified. So you then got, what was the Second Crusade? Why did the Second Crusade happen? Who took part in the Second Crusade? Was the Second Crusade a success or failure for the Christians? Why? You pause it here and write the questions down and answer them in as much detail as you can. And then you've got a real brief history of the First and the Second Crusade. There's an overview table of the First and Second Crusade. You can use that to help you with the questions as well as the information. So task 3, why did the Third Crusade happen? This is the focus that the exam board want you to know more. Looking at why the Third Crusade actually occurred. So the Third Crusade was between 1189 and 1192, but the reasons for it occurred before this. So it says the Muslim leader Saladin's main aim was to recapture Jerusalem, which was still under control by Christian crusaders. Saladin led a huge army of 30,000 men in 1187 and defeated the Christian army at the Battle of Hattin. This wasn't the Crusade. The Crusade has not happened yet. It doesn't happen until 1189. But what this battle does do is it means that the Christians lose control of Jerusalem. It led to hundreds of deaths and many Christians being captured. Among these were King Guy of Jerusalem and Reynold of Hattin, which they were very important Christian individuals. Saladin ordered the murder of all the Christian Knights Templar and Knights Hospitalier, sworn enemies of Saladin. They were the people who protected the Crusader states. They became more militarized as time went on, but the fact that they were murdered brutally, that was something that a lot of Christian people couldn't forgive, and they wanted revenge. Once the Muslims captured Jerusalem, they took down Christian crosses from the mosques. There were no other damage to Christian property. The news of Saladin capturing Jerusalem spread to Europe quickly. In October 1187, Pope Gregory VIII called for a new crusade to the Holy Land. He issued an official document called a papal bull, which described the horrors of the Battle of Hattin, classing the Muslims as enemies. Shock turned to determination to get the Holy Land, to get Jerusalem back. Now, it doesn't seem like the Muslims did much after the Battle of Hattin, but there was some propaganda that was created saying that the Muslims had pulled down the crosses, they urinated on them, they dragged the cross through horse dung. This is something that was sort of made up after the Battle of Hattin to try and get people to join. But it was one reason why you could argue the Third Crusade happened, because there was a lot of anger towards the Muslims. So you write down as many reasons you can think of as why the Third Crusade happened. Aim for 5 to 7 reasons. So one of them could be the role of Saladin, the fact that he unified the Muslims and he was determined to recapture Jerusalem. You could talk about the Battle of Hattin and how Saladin had a huge army of 30,000 men. Talk about any reason why the Third Crusade could happen because of this information here. We are going to go through some more in a minute, but just spend 5 minutes jotting down with the subtitle, why did the Third Crusade happen? Jot down as many reasons you can think of about why it happened. Pause the video here, spend 5 to 6 minutes on this, and we'll move on. So these are the reasons you could have had for the Third Crusade. So you could have had Jerusalem was still in the hands of Christians and Saladin wanted to get it back. Saladin took a huge army of 30,000 men and defeated the Christians at the Battle of Hattin, led to many deaths and shock in England due to the brutality of Saladin. Saladin had the Knights Hospitalier and Templars brutally murdered, which was seen as very un-Christian and against the concept of just war. Muslims captured Jerusalem. That was obviously a big reason why this happened. News spread to Europe quickly and encouraged people to join. And the Pope Gregory VIII called for the Crusade in 1187, describing how bad the Battle of Hattin was, promising all men an indulgence if they took part. Remember, an indulgence, ticket to heaven. If you've not got any of those, you can add it to your list. But the last task. We've got the evidence and we just need to explain why it would have caused the Third Crusade. So your job is to write down the evidence and then say this would cause the Third Crusade because. We'll go through one, okay? But I'll read the evidence. It's something we've just been through in the last slide. Saladin brutally took land in the Battle of Hattin. Many crusaders were killed or captured. Among those captured were King Guy of Jerusalem and Reynold of Hattin, who broke a truce with Saladin. Now, why would this cause a Third Crusade? Well, it's very simple. The Battle of Hattin, it would help if I just add some colour to the writing. The Battle of Hattin led to the fall of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was very important to the Christians due to the links to the life of Jesus. There was a lot of anger from the Christians as the king of Jerusalem was captured. You could also say that the fact that Muslims were now under control of Jerusalem could have given a reason to crusade by the Christians. So your job, go through each one of these and add an element of evidence. To be honest, you could actually say the Third Crusade started because of the Second Crusade, because if the fall of Edessa didn't happen, then potentially the Battle of Hattin may never have happened. But who knows? That might be purely speculative. But as I say, go through each of the evidence and explain why it would have caused the Third Crusade. You should only spend about 5-6 minutes on this, and then you're at the stage where you've done the lesson. So by the end of this lesson, you've got an understanding of what a crusade is, why people go on crusade, and more importantly, why the Third Crusade happened. But you also know the history of the first and second. So just going back to we know what crusade means, we looked at the history, and we've evaluated the immediate causes of the Third Crusade.